The word for today is ubiquitous. Ubiquitous is an adjective. Ubiquitous means something that is found everywhere or very common. The Wall Street Journal, December 19, 2023. In an article about tipping trends, the first paragraph reads, "People are cutting back on tipping, frustrated by ubiquitous requests for gratuities." Gratuities means tips. Here, ubiquitous means tip requests are very common and seen everywhere, causing frustration and less tipping. The Washington Post, August 6, 2016. In an article about the increased use of trained dogs for security, the first paragraph reads, "Trained dogs are becoming as ubiquitous as security cameras and as visible as X-ray machines across the United States." Here, ubiquitous means trained dogs are now very common, seen everywhere like cameras and X-ray machines as part of security. Any tricks to remember this word? Ubiquitous sounds like you be quick to see it everywhere. You be quick to see it everywhere. This can help remind you that something ubiquitous is found everywhere or is very common. Ubiquitous.
The second word is revolt. Revolt means to rise up against authority or reject control, often in protest or rebellion. For example, troops were called in to crush the revolt. The army is in revolt against its commanders. Any tricks to remember this word? To remember revolt, we can think of re-involt. Re is again. And volt might make you think of electricity or power, like a jolt of energy or shock. So, revolt is like pushing back strongly again and again against something unfair. Revolt.
Another word for today is prolific. Prolific means producing a lot of something like ideas, art, or work quickly and often. For example, she's a prolific writer. She publishes a new book every year. She's a prolific writer. She publishes a new book every year. Any tricks to remember this word? To remember prolific, think of pro as a lot and life means full of energy or growth. So, prolific means full of life, producing a lot of things like a tree full of fruit or an artist with lots of work. Prolific, prolific, prolific.
Another word for today is legislation. Legislation is a noun. Legislation refers to a new law or changes made to existing laws. For example, the government has promised to introduce legislation to limit fuel emissions from cars. The government has promised to introduce legislation to limit fuel emissions from cars. Any tricks to remember this word? To remember legislation, think of legal, related to law, and station, a place where things happen. So, legislation is like the station or process where laws are made and put into action. Legislation.
Now that you've got the useful vocabulary, we'll start reading the article, and you'll see these words again. Don't worry, I'll still explain them to help you remember them better. Ubiquitous demands for tips bring revolt. Ubiquitous means something that is everywhere or very common. Revolt means people are pushing back or protesting against something they don't like. So ubiquitous demands for tips bring revolt means that the constant requests for tips everywhere are causing people to push back or protest. People are cutting back on tipping, frustrated by ubiquitous requests for gratuities. Cutting back means reducing something. We can say, "I'm cutting back on sugar to improve my health." Or the company is cutting back on expenses this quarter. Gratuities is another word for tips. You might say, "The restaurant adds a gratuity for large groups." Or, gratuities are often expected in the service industry. This sentence means that people are tipping less because they are annoyed by constant requests for tips, which seem to be everywhere. As of November, service sector workers in non-restaurant leisure and hospitality jobs made $1.28 an hour in tips, on average, down 7% from the $1.38 an hour they made the previous year. Non-restaurant leisure and hospitality workers are people who work in places like hotels, parks, or gyms. The data is according to an analysis of 300,000 small and medium-sized businesses by payroll provider Gusto.
This paragraph basically tells us that people are tipping less because they're tired of being asked for tips everywhere. By November, non-restaurant workers in hospitality were earning an average of $1.28 an hour in tips, which is 7% less than last year. Seems like people are getting fed up with all the tipping requests. But it's tough for workers who rely on tips, especially if their earnings are dropping like that.
The tipping slowdown is a gloomy development for all types of workers who rely on holiday tips as a chunk of their annual income. Tipping slowdown refers to people leaving fewer tips. Slowdown means it's happening less or not as much as before. Gloomy development. Gloomy means something bad or depressing. Development here means a new change or situation. So this change is negative or sad. Chunk is a casual way of saying a big part or a significant amount. So the sentence is saying that workers who depend on holiday tips are in trouble because they're getting fewer tips, which they need for a big part of their yearly pay. It reflects a broad frustration with the proliferation of tip requests at dry cleaners and bridal boutiques, and even self-checkout machines that have sprung up since the pandemic. Proliferation is a fancy way of saying there's been a big increase in something. Sprung up is the past tense of spring up, means something appeared quickly or suddenly. We can say, new apartment buildings spring up every year in the city, or pop-up stores tend to spring up around the holidays.
So, this sentence is saying a lot of people are annoyed because they're being asked to leave tips in more and more places, even at places like dry cleaners, wedding shops, and at self-checkout machines. This has become more common since the pandemic started.
Mary Medley, a Denver retiree who described herself to the Wall Street Journal in July as a unilaterally prolific tipper, is one of those who has become more discerning in recent months. A retiree is someone who has retired and doesn't work anymore. Unilaterally means doing something on your own without asking others. We can say the boss unilaterally changed the meeting time, or he unilaterally decided to cancel the event. Prolific tipper means she used to give a lot of tips or tip very often. Prolific is commonly used to describe someone or something that is very productive or generates a lot of output. For example, a prolific writer writes many books or articles. A prolific artist creates a lot of artwork. Here in this sentence, prolific tipper means she used to give a lot of tips or tip very often. Discerning. Become more discerning in recent months. Discern means being more thoughtful or picky about her choices. We can say, he has become more discerning about the books he reads lately. Or shoppers have become more discerning when it comes to choosing sustainable products. It feels not as good to tip now that it's popping up everywhere, says Medley, 70 years old. It feels not as good is an informal way to say, it doesn't feel as good. We can use this sentence structure often in daily conversation. Feels not as good to do something now that it's something. For example, we can say, it feels not as exciting to visit that cafe now that the menu has changed. Or it feels not as rewarding to exercise when I don't see progress. What started out to be a way to acknowledge excellent personal service feels like it's become a way to help supplement worker compensation. What started out to be means the original purpose of tipping, which was to recognize or reward good personal service. Feels like it's become. Feels like indicates a change in perception. It's suggesting that tipping is no longer viewed in the same way. What started out to be something feels like it's become something. We can use this structure in daily conversation. For example, what started out as a simple idea feels like it's become a big project. What started out to be a fun hobby feels like it's become a full-time job.
So in this part, Mary shared her feeling about tipping, from something voluntary and special to something more expected and widespread.
There is a cost to the tipping slowdown, say economists and business owners. When people tip less, workers suffer, says Jonathan Morduch, a professor of public policy and economics at New York University. We're in a situation where workers still want and expect and need tips to some degree, he says. Some businesses are raising worker pay in part as a response to lower gratuities. In part as a response to means doing something partly because of a specific reason. Gratuities means tips. So some businesses are increasing worker pay partly because people are tipping less. Dan Moreno, founder of Miami-based Flamingo Appliance Service, says he has noticed a slowdown in customers leaving tips for their repair people since the Journal spoke with him in July. The average base wages for his techs have gone up about 10% since then, though he hasn't eliminated the prompt from point-of-sale machines. Base wages means the regular pay workers get before any extra tips, though he hasn't eliminated the prompt from point-of-sale machines. Prompt refers to the tip request on the payment machine. Eliminate means to remove something. Point-of-sale machines means POS machines.
So even though wages went up, Dan Moreno still keeps the tip option on his POS machines. Seems like he's making sure they get paid either way. Kind of clever, right?
I don't know if that's because customers are just over it. I'll tell you personally, I'm a little bit over it. Moreno says of how his own tipping habits have changed over the past year. Customers are just over it. Over it means being tired of something. We can say, I'm so over it I can't deal with this drama anymore. Or, she was over it and just walked away from the argument. Meanwhile, governments have started to get involved. In October, Chicago became the second largest U.S. city to vote to require tipped workers to make the full minimum wage. The full federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, while the federal tipped minimum wage many bar and restaurant workers earn is $2.13 an hour.
So in short, the federal minimum wage is higher, but tipped workers earn much less because tipped workers rely on customer tips to make up the difference. What do you think about this? Do you think tips should replace fair wages? Share your thoughts in the comments.
Legislation to get rid of tipped minimums is moving in 8 states. And measures are on the ballot in 4, according to worker advocacy organization One Fair Wage. Legislation refers to a new law or changes made to existing laws. Tipped minimums means the minimum wage for workers who receive tips. Is moving in 8 states. In other words, the process to change the law is happening in 8 states. Measures are on the ballot. Ballot means vote. Measures, in this context, is a noun. Refers to proposed laws or actions for people to vote on, like changes in policy. So, measures are on the ballot in 4. Means, in 4 of those states, people will vote on these proposals.
Basically, the point here is that new laws to stop the lower minimum wage for tipped workers are being discussed in 8 states, and people in 4 states will vote on this issue.
There's an ongoing rejection of the whole system by both workers and consumers who have been increasingly pissed about it, says Sara Jayaraman, director of the Food Labor Research Center at the University of California, Berkeley, and president of One Fair Wage, an advocate for higher wages for restaurant workers. Restaurant workers earned an average of $3.83 an hour in tips and overtime in November, according to technology company Square, up 8% from the previous year. Between November 2020 and November 2022, that amount rose 50% to $3.54 from $2.36 an hour.
In short, restaurant workers earn more tips since 2020. But why are they protesting? Restaurant workers are protesting because, even though their tips have increased, many still rely heavily on these tips to make a living, often earning very low base wages. They want a more stable and fair income, like a guaranteed higher minimum wage, so they don't have to depend so much on tips, which can be unpredictable.
While governments, workers, and owners wrestle with what to do about tipping, consumers have embraced the humor in tipping's massive expansion into so many parts of life. Jokes mocking tipping's proliferation have spread on social media sites. Proliferation means something that is growing or spreading quickly. In one image, a police officer holds out a tablet with different tip options after giving someone a speeding ticket. In another, someone pretends to ask for a tip for letting a stranger pet her dog.
I wonder if I'll need to start tipping my microwave for heating my food.
And don't forget to leave a 20% tip for the toaster too. Okay, let's carry on. Here's what happens next. Garrett Bemiller, a 26-year-old who works in communications, started to question his standard practice of always leaving 20% after being asked for a tip at a self-serve checkout station at an airport in April. We all know how absurd it is that it almost relieves some of that guilt in saying no, he says. He now always hits no tip when he's buying a black coffee, even when friends are watching.
Would you leave tips to a coffee machine? Leave your comment below.
Holiday tips. One area people might not cut back is tipping for the holidays. Of the 2,413 U.S. adults surveyed by financial services company Bankrate, 15% said they plan to leave more generous tips for workers including housekeepers, childcare workers, landscapers and mail carriers this year. About 13% said they plan to leave less.
Looks like people get more generous during the holidays. Must be the holiday spirit kicking in.
Median amounts are so far up from last year across the 6 types of service providers Bankrate asked about. Median amounts. This refers to the middle value in a set of numbers. It shows the typical or most common tipping amount. We can say, the median house price in the area is $300,000, or the median income in this city is $50,000. It seems that people view holiday tipping differently, perhaps because of the holiday spirit, and also because of the regular interaction with many of these service providers, Bankrate analyst Ted Rossman says. B. Miller plans to give the super in his New York City building $100 not because he feels like he has to, but because he wants to. In this context, super is short for superintendent, which refers to the person responsible for the maintenance and management of an apartment building or complex, often handling repairs and other resident needs. She helps me so much throughout the year and that tip seems genuinely justified, he says. The cutback reflects a broad frustration with the proliferation of tip requests. Proliferation means the rapid increase or spread of something. Let's move on to our small talk section. Now that we've read and understood the article, let's see how we can bring it up in conversation with others.
Have you noticed how tipping requests seem to pop up everywhere now? I got asked to tip at a self-checkout the other day.
Oh, I know. It's everywhere these days. Even for things like coffee where no one's really doing extra work.
Right? It feels like tipping used to mean great service, but now it's expected for everything. Makes it hard to keep up. I read that people are still tipping more during the holidays but cutting back everywhere else.
That makes sense. Holidays are different. It feels good to show appreciation.
Exactly. It's like holiday tips for people we see often still feel right. I'll tip my mail carrier, but maybe not at a kiosk. Have you seen those jokes about tipping? Like a police officer asking for a tip after giving a ticket.
Yes. Those are hilarious. The tipping culture's gotten so out of hand, it's become a meme.
Right? It's like we need a tip-free option at this point. I heard someone joke about needing to tip just to pet someone's dog.
That's hilarious, but so true. It's like, where does it end?
Exactly. It's kind of funny how tipping's gone from appreciation to just obligation. Did you hear Chicago's raising the minimum wage for tipped workers? Wonder if other cities will follow.
Interesting. It might help with all this tipping frustration. No one likes feeling obligated.
Exactly. It would be nice to know workers are fairly paid without feeling pressured to tip everywhere.
Try practicing this topic with a colleague next time you're making small talk. Let me know if you give it a go. And share how it went in the comments section below. And that brings us to the end of this video. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on future content.